If you would like to earn CPE credit for listening to the show, visit earmarkcpe.com/FPA. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Finally, if you enjoy listening to FP&A today, please go to your podcast platform of choice, click the subscribe button, and leave a rating and review of the show. And now, on to the show.
From Data Rails, this is FP&A Today.
Welcome to FP&A Today. I'm your host, Glenn Hopper. Today, we're joined by Bobby Bray. Bobby is a CFA charter holder with more than 20 years of experience across banking and consulting with a strong focus on capital markets. He's built and led analytics functions at scale for some of the world's largest financial institutions, including Capital One. And before that, advised Fortune 500 clients as a senior manager at Oliver Wyman. He's also a retired Navy captain, having commanded thousands of sailors and brought that leadership experience into the world of finance. In his career, Bobby has sat at the intersection of capital markets, treasury, and analytics, working on everything from stress testing and regulatory engagement to data transformation and risk modeling. On today's show, we'll explore what FP&A leaders can learn from these areas, how to scale analytics, apply the rigor of stress testing to forecasting, and navigate the rise of AI with an eye toward compliance and explainability. Bobby, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. How are you today?
Doing great. I love your background. I love your journey. I can't wait to dive into it. From Navy captain to investment banking, consulting at Oliver Wyman, and now capital markets and analytics at Capital One. I guess I really want to go back to your Navy career and as you were thinking about transitioning out and when you started to lean into investment banking. And first off, you don't look old enough to have done half of it. So, is that ageist to say or not ageist? I don't know. But I'd love it.
Yeah, no worries. I got a filter on this camera. How about that?
Yeah. So if you could kind of just walk us through your progression, I'm sure our audience would love to hear about it.
Yeah, sure thing. It's definitely not a traditional path. I will say that. My journey began, not to make it too long, but my journey began at the U.S. Naval Academy. After which, once I graduated, I went to flight school and then into the aviation community in the U.S. Navy. I was a carrier-based helicopter pilot for a number of years before transitioning into the reserves. As I transitioned, I went to grad school to get an MBA, and then I went into commercial banking. That was the first step, investment banking, then management consulting. That was where I did my tour of duty on Wall Street, if you will. And that was Oliver Wyman. And then finally the Capital One. And all along that career path, I was also staying very active in the Navy, particularly in the reserves. It's a bit of a fallacy. This 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, it tends to be much, much more than that. But I was very glad to do it. It was very rewarding. And both careers were parallel path, and they kind of complement each other, which I can go into later. But then I finally culminated the Navy career as I retired as a Navy captain. So when people say non-traditional path, I think I understand what they mean. That feels like a non-traditional path. And I believe you'd ask, kind of where I got into finance, that sort of thing. And for me, the finance piece was very natural. I was an engineering undergrad, and I always liked numbers and kind of technical problems. That tends to be where my mind goes. So when going through grad school, I naturally gravitated to finance, and not so much as, I don't want to say this in the bad, not so much the softer things like marketing and organizational structures. Very important aspects of business, just not where my mind went. My mind tended to like the structure of numbers and finance a little bit more than the open, kind of the white space of those areas. So after grad school and after the military, I went to commercial banking. Commercial banking to this day is probably the most educational job I've had in the private sector. And I've had a few. And the reason is commercial banking is essentially about how companies make money. A commercial banker cares about lending money and how are we going to get paid back. And the way you figure out if a company can pay you back is figuring out how they turn a product into money. And do they make enough money to pay you back? And the reality is it's a fundamental skill of business. It's not market driven. It's not analytic. AI will do a little bit of stuff. This is pre-AI. But at the end of the day, it's turning product into money. And I use those skills all along. I kind of reached a point where I wanted to stretch myself a little bit more. And at this point, I was still afflicted, if that's the right word, with the militaryism of you've been in a job for a couple of years or 3 years, you got to move on. I was in commercial banking longer than that, but I felt this itch to do something more and learning something else, and I thought I could stretch myself in a bit of a different environment. So I went in at that point. I went into investment banking. I decided on a boutique investment bank that focused primarily on sell side M&A. So it was a great exposure, great entry into capital markets and marketing companies and valuation, which is a completely different side than what your commercial banker would do. So it's still finance, but a different focus. And then from there, I thought I'd gone into boutique, which was a great entry point for me, but I knew that I needed a bigger firm to kind of grow. And I was looking at bulge bracket iBanks or the kind of the big 4 or 5 consulting firms. And my mindset was I like the deal aspect of investment banking, but I also like the problem solving of consulting, which we essentially did at the boutique firm. So I gravitated towards Oliver Wyman, which just to me added another dimension. And this was where I started to get into a deeper understanding of capital markets. And I was in one of the horizontals. If you can think about, like, a consulting firm has a number of verticals: commercial banking, investment banking, insurance, wealth management, whatever they specialize in. And there's a couple functions in every big firm that's horizontal and spans them all. I went to the one that spanned it all, and it was called Strategic IT and Operations. Played on my Navy career in the operations piece, but the IT piece and the technical piece spanned them all. And I was again fortunate in that I had exposures to the entire panoply of finance. I got to see a number of different segments, which was again very, very rewarding. Like a lot of former consultants, the lifestyle started to wear on me, and I finally decided to make the jump to Capital One. And Capital One allowed me to bridge all the worlds. It was keep in mind that I was still continuing to do Navy Reserve, and I was actually getting fairly senior and doing some extremely interesting things on the defense side. And at Capital One, I was able to combine kind of leadership, the technical analysis that I had built up over the years, and finance to help Capital One make kind of sharper, faster decisions and amalgamate a bunch of them. So that's the non-traditional journey that kind of gets me to this spot right here.
Yeah. Well, when you say it like that, it actually makes perfect sense. So, yeah, you know, and I apologize if you get this question all the time, and you may be tired of answering it, but we know, to be a Navy captain, how important leadership has to be to you kind of throughout your life. And so I know I'm sure you're always asked, how has your military background influenced the way that you approach leadership in the civilian world? But I also think, being a naval aviator, it seems like it would take down the temperature of business decisions. You know, the kind of decisions you make as an aviator versus in the business world. That's not to say that you would be flippant about any of it, but at the same time, it sort of sets everything. So if you could, just for our listeners, I know I'm sure you get asked all the time, but we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, love it. That's a good, yeah, I do get that question, but it's a good question, and I can remember the very first time I received it. I knew that it caused me to pause and think, because you knew that there were things that connected, but being able to articulate and think through it was actually helpful for me in understanding kind of where I could grow as a leader and what I could bring to Capital One and the different, different companies that I've worked for. And I think I've boiled it down to a couple things. One is the military teaches you two big things: kind of decisiveness and resiliency. You rarely have, in a military setting, you rarely have perfect information, but you still need to act, and need to own the decision. Aviation is maybe well, I'll get to that in a second. Aviation is a perfect example of this. You have every instrument, but you still might see some lights, or you might see a gauge doing something that you don't know. And you have to make decisions with imperfect information to the best that you can. And it's, again, it's never in the back of your mind. You're never thinking about it in the front of your mind about what the implications are if you make the wrong decision. But in the back of your mind, you know that there's a certain part of aviation that's unforgiving. And that might not be the same case in finance. But The stakes are different, but the principles still hold in finance. And I very much over time realized that I lean heavily on the leadership lessons from the Navy. The Navy does, and the military in general does very well when they have clarity of mission, when you know what the focal point is, when you empower people. Particularly in the U.S. military, we are one of the strengths of the U.S. military is we empower people at the lowest level possible to make decisions and to feel comfortable making those decisions. It truly is one of the key elements of our secret sauce of U.S. military success. And you also have to take care of your team. If you get those right, the technical side tends to follow. The same thing applies in finance. And I would also suggest that the other thing that is carried over from the military is just a comfort in making decisions. You're expected to make decisions in the military and occasionally make wrong decisions, and occasionally you hear about it. Well, when you do make wrong decisions, you do hear about it. But at the same point, it's always in a learning kind of conducive to growth perspective. You're doing it to be coached to be better at your job in the military. Sometimes that doesn't necessarily apply in finance. In the world of finance, sometimes it's easier to push decisions up, to push them up the chain, and to get collaboration on it. And I'm not suggesting that's wrong, but unfortunately, if you don't develop that skill early, at some point you will be to the top of the chain, and you will need to make the decisions. And it's a hard lesson to learn when you're kind of later in your career and you're not comfortable making decisions being in that spot. So I do think that there is one thing those are a few of the things that the military has brought. And when you're learning to fly, one of the very first lessons, this seems counterintuitive, this is a bit of an aviation story, is that you're taught to wind the clock if you ever have an emergency, even if it's just a simulated emergency. And that's somewhat joking, but the old wind up clocks that were in the legacy aircraft that people in the military learned on. And the reason is, if you take the time to reach out there and wind the clock, you prevent yourself from making rash, rushed decisions. And that is one thing that I have brought with me to the finance world. When anything happens, and my hair is rarely on fire, I try to wind the clock. Some people think that means I'm indifferent. It doesn't mean I'm indifferent. It just means I'm processing and I'm trying to slow down the problem set so that I don't do anything rash.
I love that. I used to always tell my team that there should not be an emergency in finance. If we're having a true if there's a global financial crisis or whatever,
yeah.
But we do the same thing every month.
Yeah.
That nothing should be,
Yeah.
So just taking out of that hair on fire mode. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all that. And we talked quite a bit before we came on the show, and obviously we're going to get into finance, but one of the things that we talked a lot about was analytics and data. And I think that's probably a good place for us to start the talk here, because and we joked about big data, and we'll get to that as well.
Sure.
But it's the foundation for not just good FP&A, good finance, but especially as we move into AI. So, So you built analytics teams at scale, highly regulated global institutions. And from your perspective, kind of riding this wave of where analytics started being a useful enough of a process that it got its own department and group, what lessons can FP&A take from analytics, and what's sort of your approach there? That's a horribly worded question. You know where I'm going.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, because it's at the essence of kind of the evolution of an FP&A shop, right? That's kind of where it stands now. It's maybe a little dated, but that same mindset is what has gotten us here today. So yeah, you're spot on about that. And I think that the key thing for me is at scale, analytics is less about the math and more about the plumbing and the people. It's about having it certainly is about having clean, reliable data, kind of consistent definitions, and very importantly, a team culture that is curious but disciplined, which is a very analytical way of viewing the world. Analytics mean nothing and you can kind of see the melding of those in an analytics space. You create new analytics, or you explore analytics with a curious mind. It's not just a number that you take prima facie and move on. You need to challenge that, and you need to explore it. But that's a different part of the mind than somebody who's just pushing a button and spitting out a number. So those are a little bit in conflict, but they're not incompatible. They can certainly be in the same mind, and they can certainly be in the same team. But you have to do so in a very disciplined way, because FP&A is very much about being disciplined and rigorous in all the structures that go into creating the analytics that you need. So you can see that there's overlap. Hopefully it's kind of clear that there is overlap, but they serve different purposes. So and if there's one kind of key lesson, it's don't just focus on the model. Focus on the process. That's where the discipline comes from. And if you focus on the process and not just the model, you'll get it right. The model will do what it's supposed to do, and it'll allow you to fix things or adjust things down the road if need be. But at least you know the process is accurate. And I would suggest that the other thing to do is make sure your team understands where the data comes from, what it means, and how to use it responsibly. So there's to use an aviation term, you need to be able to follow the drop of gas through the engine and understand the different cogs in the engine that turns, a drop of gas into thrust in aviation, but it also is what turns raw data into usable analytics on the back end. So did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I dwelling a bit on data governance too, because I know, especially in the industry you're in, that's so important, but obviously to FP&A as well. So I'd love, just because we spent some time talking about it, and I'd love for you to share with our listeners your insights. If you can talk about the importance of data governance, the data dictionaries, identifying that source of truth, managing latency, and really how to approach that, and as FP&A professionals, how to think about data governance.
Yeah. So here's I'm going to tell everybody's secret. Data governance is unglamorous, but it really is the backbone of trust. To your point, like a good data dictionary, a clear source of truth, and clarity on latency. That's what prevents teams from arguing over numbers instead of solving problems. And that's kind of the key piece. For FP&A, it's critical. If finance doesn't agree on the baseline data, if they don't understand on the forecast, then everything that comes downstream, whether it be a board deck or any other product, becomes a battle of versions instead of a single story. That makes the analytics and the decision making based on that analytics very, very clouded and very, very opaque. So getting the data governance right is paramount. Unfortunately, it's not glamorous. It is literally making sure that everything's buttoned up. It's cleaning and tidying. It's housekeeping. Nobody ever says I have a really clean house after a weekend, but try to be really functional in your living space or in your workspace without a clean house. Being clean and organized is what effectively the analog to data governance is in an FP&A team. It does the same thing. So the unglamorous data governance is the key, and a rigorous process that kind of engenders trust and builds confidence that will allow for more robust analysis down the road. And instead of having people worry about accuracy of the data. So it's not glamorous, but it is absolutely necessary.
You're totally preaching to the choir on that. And it's so funny, as a consultant right now, every call starts with, can you please come into our business and sprinkle some AI onto it?
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you 9 times out of 10, we're not doing anything until we get your data house in order. And in the 1 time out of 10 is because it is that rare business that, oh, wow, you've actually got it together. Yeah. And when we do these projects, it's much more of a data engineering and just a data and not even data engineering always. Sometimes it's as simple as, let's identify the sources of truth. Let's have that data dictionary. And it is unglamorous, and nobody wants to pay anybody to do it, but they don't want to do the work either. But you have to have data governance in order. I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you want a foundation for AI, sorry, somebody's got to do that.
Yeah, not to take us off track, but you kind of reminded me of something funny that I always remember in my consulting days. And that is, every consultant gets into the profession thinking they're going to solve these massive problems and do this glorious strategy. And oftentimes, and you do a little bit of that, but oftentimes you end up doing the things that your client just doesn't want to do. And that's the unglamorous side of consulting, but it's the reality. And to your point, you hit the nail right on the head. Data governance is a thing that people don't want to do. It's just it is what it is, but it's absolutely critical.
FP&A Today is brought to you by DataRails, the world's #1 FP&A solution. DataRails is the artificial intelligence-powered financial planning and analysis platform built for Excel users. That's right, you can stay in Excel. But instead of facing hell for every budget, month-end close, or forecast, you can enjoy a paradise of data consolidation, advanced visualization, reporting, and AI capabilities. Plus, game-changing insights giving you instant answers and your story created in seconds. Find out why more than 1,000 finance teams use DataRails to uncover their company's real story. Don't replace Excel, embrace Excel. Learn more at datarails.com. Another thing we talked about, and it was kind of funny because when I said it out loud, it just sounded awkward. But when I mentioned big data, 10 years ago, all we were talking about was big data. And now we're just talking about data. And I didn't realize, I don't know when the last time I said big data was, but when do you think that shift happened where we just kind of realized, no, this is just the data that everybody has? I'm laying that as foundation because I want to talk about what we talked about cloud infrastructure and where we're kind of moving with analytics and everything now.
Yeah, love it. It was kind of funny because it just happened. And I think, I never thought about putting a kind of a marker on it, but I think what happened is you hinted at cloud infrastructure. When cloud infrastructure became a thing and more people adapted to it and adopted it, the amount of data significantly increased in the world. And you can see those graphs. I'm sure your listeners have seen those graphs where it's the amount of data that's being created every day is some crazy number, like more data than was existed before 1580 or something crazy like that. Well, when that happened, it became a matter of scale. How do you distinguish between big data? And there used to be kind of a cap on it, and that cap was driven by servers and whatnot. And now it's not. When big data first came on the scene, the focus was very much on volume. There were massive data sets. There were new tools, Hadoop clusters and those kind of terms that you probably remember from your past. And today, because the volume is just overwhelming, data is just a part of the fabric of the business. Nobody even, to your point, nobody even uses the term big data. I don't know when last time I used it, anyway, except for conversations like this. It's almost like, a couple grandparents. You remember when we, but that is what it is. And now it's less about size and very much more about trust and speed, which again, kind of hinting at cloud infrastructure, that's solved. But very importantly, speed is kind of maybe the new competitive advantage. It used to be that if you just could get the volume right and you had access just to volume, or whether it was in some data lake or something along those lines, that was a competitive advantage. Now that's not the case. It's speed and use of data and being able to kind of manipulate it, if you will. That is the competitive advantage. So getting at the point where you move from centralized data was actually critical for businesses. And you could see in the marketplace, you could see the ones finance shops that were sprinting ahead because of that ability. And then I guess there was just kind of thinking out loud, I guess maybe what happened is as certain shops led, and they were almost in the bleeding edge of kind of getting to a different state where data just became a part of it. They started to gain comfort in the resiliency and the performance of the data and the data sets that they now were allowed to use. And you could kind of see in the best sense how exploitive this new way of looking at data was. And it became a very competitive advantage. So now, data lakes and whatnot are kind of relics of the past, and everything is off-prem. Cloud-based solutions, as you suggested, are the norm. And just kind of bringing it home to what we're talking about for FP&A teams, this kind of created a mindset of shifting from collect everything to curating what matters. And it almost became very much a quality over quantity because everybody has quantity now.
I want to move on, but I can't because you mentioned Hadoop.
Yeah.
And this is the second time in 2 days. I'm dealing with I'm working with a client now, big company, their name. Yep. They are still operating from a Hadoop cluster. I haven't thought about Hadoop since like 2014, maybe. I don't know. But back then it was amazing. But the fact is, and they're not looking anyway, they're using cloud stuff now. They're not looking to migrate the Hadoop stuff. It's basically, how can we access what we use? But I love that I hadn't thought about that in years. And suddenly now in 2 days, I'm getting back to back Hadoop.
Yeah, there you go. The blast. You're exactly, I don't want to take us too far afield, but you're exactly right. And the problem is that, and I think that's where the competitive advantage and the sprint of some companies over others is kind of taking place. Back in the day, if you will, a decade ago, a lot of companies spent a lot of money to get what they thought was the cutting edge solution. And the next thing you know, within about 5 years, the industry quickly migrated away from their very expensive solution. And sometimes it's hard. I mean, it's kind of a sunk cost type thing where you're like, wait, we've just spent a lot of money on this solution, and you're telling me 5 years later it's now a relic and our competitors are sprinting away. And the answer is yeah. So sometimes that's tough medicine to swallow.
Yeah. All right. Now I'm going to have dreams about MapReduce and HDFS and all that.
Sorry about that. Sorry, you blame me.
But actually, that it is interesting thinking about how much we've evolved. And that was certainly when we were in the Hadoop era. That's when we were talking about big data, and it was, how are we going to handle all this? And now everything in the cloud. But talk a little bit about cloud infrastructure and what that means just to analytics cycles. We're basically moving from what used to take weeks, we're now into hours. And I'm, translating that to what that means for finance teams. What does that mean for the velocity of work that we're doing?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. So this is probably one of the more critical changes that has taken place on FP&A teams over, I don't know, maybe the last 7 years, just kind of throwing a marker out there. And it's one that's been borrowed by other parts and other elements of the business. That's the key thing there. This is not necessarily one where, at least in my experience, where FP&A teams led. They didn't necessarily lead into the space, but other teams led, and then FP&A followed. And that's not a bad thing. But as part of the teams moved into cloud-based solutions, and a lot of those functions were kind of customer facing or whatnot, or some backroom operational stuff moved into cloud-based solutions. It started to infuse firms, and FP&A followed. And that's not a bad thing. But even though FP&A teams followed, it's had a profound effect, and it's kind of changed the game. More importantly, the conversation shifted. So instead of spending time just to produce forecasts, teams can spend more time interpreting those forecasts. They can pressure test it. They can ask the so what questions and kind of what if questions that used to not be in the lexicon of an FP&A team. That's not necessarily their remit, but now it's become part of what they do. But it also required, the other side of it is, change is constant, but that speed also required FP&A teams to upskill. So you need people who can think critically and act quickly, because now the customers, the downstream customers, whoever that might be for your particular FP&A team, they want the answers in real time. And to your point about like weeks to hours, used to be, there was a different use of the word latency, but there used to be like an embedded, we ask a question and it's going to take them a couple weeks to get an answer. That's a luxury that nobody really has anymore. That even if it's unfair, that's a luxury that nobody really has anymore. And that time has been compressed. So yeah, I don't know. Cloud infrastructure has changed the game. It's changed the conversation. It's changed the skill set, but pretty much all for the better. Because if you think about what was before, it's hard to argue that we left a lot behind by making this transition.
Absolutely. So the data, the infrastructure, that's all the foundation. Once we have that, I love having guests on who aren't working in straight up FP&A. Well, obviously we talk mostly to people working in FP&A, but I love, like we had a quant on a few weeks ago, and I love talking to people in slightly different, but disciplines where the Venn diagram crosses over, because if we're trying to come up with best practices for FP&A, risk, scenario planning, stress testing, the kind that you do, I feel like there's a lot that we could take away from that and apply it to FP&A. So I'm thinking about capital market stress test,
Yep.
subject to regulatory scrutiny, the amount of rigor that you have to have.
Yeah.
And then, then there's internal scenario planning that FP&A teams do. But I feel like that there's a level of, I don't want to say not complexity for complexity's sake, but having that rigor, but then also having them, maybe robust is a better word, having that stronger model. I guess if you could maybe lay the foundation with, explain that the model, the capital market stress test, how that works, and then how we could apply that in FP&A, or take the best principles of it.
Love it. Yeah, that's a really solid question, and it spans the arc of our discussion, which is really awesome. For anybody who hasn't been in this space, the long and the short of it is, pre 2008, some banks did some sort of scenario testing or some sort of analytics on their balance sheet. It tended not to be really rigorous or really hard. You kind of always passed yourself. And then after 2008, and then subsequently with the Dodd-Frank Act, capital stress tests became mandatory for banks. And there was a very, 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 very painful learning curve from, I don't know, pick about 2012 to about 2015, 16, 17, right in there, where banks were trying to get good at stress testing. And the general process was an examiner would come and an agency would come in, and they would expect you to be stress testing your own balance sheet, and your capital structure kind of writ large. And then they would give you a scenario, very much like you can kind of see the arc of a college type thing. They would give you a scenario, and then they would ask you to test these scenarios, these economic scenarios. You can kind of think about what it would be. Unemployment is 4%. What happens if it goes to 10%? What happens if, these give you like a laundry list of economic variables? You project those onto your balance sheet, and then they come in and they project your balance sheet in those same scenarios, and then they compare answers. Because they're the teacher, their answers were always right, although some people would argue about it. But it had real world consequences, and those real world consequences were, at the end of the day, they are going to set their required capital levels for a bank based on those stress tests. So, first of all, those stress tests did two things. One, they were kind of in one sense, in capital markets, they were kind of about survival. Like, can you survive these kind of scenarios with real world implications? And that being, they're going to see if you can withstand shocks, and then they're going to charge you capital to make sure that you can. So those are real world implications for the capital markets and the teams that are running capital in a large organization. The FP&A scenario analysis is less existential. I don't know if that's the right word, but I'll stick with it. But no less important. And it's very much, the mind shift is, it's preparing leaders for a range of outcomes. And the crossover between what they do in the capital space and what they do in the FP&A team is really rigor. And this is another one where FP&A kind of followed some other parts of the bank, but it was to the better. And one of the things that FP&A teams learned was rigor. Interestingly, oftentimes FP&A teams got swept into these exams, and they would be defending some of their decisions in these exams, these capital stress testing exams that happened. And from that, the FP&A teams learned, and then they borrowed, and they borrowed particularly the discipline of the capital markets teams. And it's things like, what seems a little bit of motherhood, but document your assumptions, test the extreme model outcomes, do statistical analysis of a path-dependent scenario, and always ask, what if we're wrong? That's the type of mindset that stress testing brought to FP&A. But this is also worth creating a nuance that's probably worth mentioning, and that is, the FP&A leadership needs a different skill set to manage the information they're now receiving. In a pre-stress testing world, the point in time figures were kind of taken as fact, and they should have been, they were. But in a stress testing world, leadership is given ranges of outcomes, with accompanying probabilities that must be understood. So point in time number, range of outcomes with probabilities, completely different mindset on how you interpret those things. And that is one of the things that this whole stress testing scenario analysis has carried over. Again, net positive. It's hard to think about of a way that going back to the old way of point in time estimates was better than what we see today.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned the confidence interval, because I think, from as statistics guys, we love the idea of like, here's our 95% confidence interval. This is the band it's going to be in. If I hit that,
Yeah.
We're golden. But then when you're reporting numbers to, well, your forecast to Wall Street or whatever, it's like, what do you mean you can't get it to 5 nines?
Yeah. Exactly right. And then
Yeah.
not only that, but not take us off, but that 95% confidence level, and I'll kind of channel my inner Nassim Taleb, that'll take you down if you're not careful. If you're like, no, this is always going to work. Look at my model. My VAR model works perfectly. And again, Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, all his books say not so fast, right?
Yeah.
Be careful.
Yeah. They're all right there.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, very much. Great author. So it's but that's an ambiguity that a lot of times finance folks don't necessarily feel comfortable in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, it is tough when you have the public company requirements around it as well. And I think what it comes down to, the interesting thing for stress testing is the models might be different, but that everybody understands the drivers that they're using. And it's in FP&A, and I spent a lot of time with startup and early stage companies. Those drivers can start being manipulated, or you add like another layer of assumptions and drivers to sort of tweak the number to get where you want it. And that's where you lose all rigor. And then, it's in a startup, it's one thing because you don't have historical data and you're trying to make a number work, but having that clear, whatever the drivers are, and then you can add your different features and whatever to the model, but the key drivers have to make sense to the auditors. Yeah.
We don't want to get ahead of the conversation, but what you just said is spot on. And by that, I mean, if the numbers don't, it's the joke, if the numbers don't make sense to you, you don't like the numbers, just let me know and I'll adjust the model. And there is risk in doing that. So like, in model adjustments and overlays on models, because of you're overriding your model and what it says, because you don't necessarily like the outcome. And this goes back to challenging extreme outcomes. Maybe the extreme outcome is the right outcome. It might be the right one that you don't want to hear, but you need to hear it. And maybe sometimes it's the 1 in a billion years that you can't manage to, and you just need to disregard it. That's the art, not the science of a lot of this stuff nowadays.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I want to shift gears a little bit. I mean, we're still in the same ballpark, but every guest we have to talk AI before you go. I know we've been so, but also I do think compliance around AI is important. So we can talk about the tech, sure, but so much now, especially around generative AI, and you see studies all the time, and it's as someone who's out in the market selling AI solutions to the CFO's office right now, it's making headwinds for me to have to sail into here when these models are talking about everything that's failing and, oh, this is wrong and this is wrong. But there's a lot of confusion around it. And with everything, when we were talking about machine learning before and classical AI, it's deterministic. We can, some of it, neural network and all that is a little bit opaque, but generative AI in so many ways is a complete black box model. So first, before we talk about the tech itself, I mean, in a regulated environment, black box model is a showstopper. Yeah. So I think as we're trying to figure out how to roll out AI right now, I mean, how should FP&A teams think about explainability and compliance as they're experimenting with AI in like just in planning and forecasting?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, the key thing, they're just pulling a couple terms, but explainability is kind of the key, because without explainability, definitionally, it becomes a black box, and that's a showstopper. Without explainability, the answer may be right, but it's worthless. Nobody's gonna buy it. And even if people think it's right, it won't count until it's explained. And that's the key piece. Even if it intuitively is accurate, if you can't explain it, it's not going to work. If for an FP&A shop, if you think about it in general, their credibility depends on being explainable. And if you can't walk an executive, particularly, you can't walk an executive how you got through a number, it won't stick. So that's a really important takeaway. And that's the same principle as teams kind of work through the AI. AI models are inherently a black box. They're probabilistically, determinist. That's part of AI, but they're still a little bit of a black box. And so I would suggest, as we kind of all are on this journey, this AI journey together, using AI, and particularly in this space, as an assistant, not as an oracle, is the right way, is a right degree of skepticism with AI. And there's also one critical difference between kind of traditional stress testing models created by modeling teams and those created by AI. Just kind of tying it back to something that we had said before, but I'll use that as a bit of an analog to some other things. The model created by a team in the old sense, in the old stress testing sense, or in the old FP&A just kind of sense, will get the same outcome every time if the input model doesn't change. So if you think about a spreadsheet, same data, same formula, same outcome. Nothing is going to change unless you somehow pollute the formula. That is not true in the case of AI. As AI models learn and ingest data, they will not necessarily produce the same results time after time. And a model that produces different results simply as it learns and goes along is one that's going to cause a lot of that's where use it as an assistant, not an oracle. Because if you use the same kind of tool but get different results, that goes back to explainability. You're gonna be in a bad spot.
Yeah, trying to explain that to an auditor or C-level person in your company is be kind of tough. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
I'm going to give my little rant on data privacy first, and then I want to hear it, though. I want your pushback to come from the compliance side. So when I talk to finance teams right now, so we just addressed the non-deterministic nature of AI and sort of the black box nature of it. And if it doesn't produce the same results, that's not, that might be fine in sales and marketing, not great in finance, where your trial balance has to balance.
Right.
And you've got
Right.
so I get a lot of pushback from finance teams that say we can't upload any company information because the data will be used to train the model. It's a security leak, et cetera, et cetera. My response, and this is, hold off for the compliance bit, but my response to that is, well, if you have the settings on your model right, it's not being used to train it. And oh, by the way, you're using Copilot. Well, you trust Microsoft with your email, with your OneDrive, your SharePoint, your calendar, your Teams, your meeting transcripts, and all that. SOC 2, Type 2 compliant, same data regulations apply to the AI tools as well. And if you've got the settings, or you could even have like a zero retention policy and all that. So I think data privacy has become, it's kind of a scapegoat. And to my mind, it's overblown as far as this is why we can't use generative AI. And to your point, there are other issues too. But when I say that, it's always the compliance folks who's like, well, now wait a minute.
Yeah.
And so maybe from your side, from compliance, tell me what's wrong with what I stated there.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong. I think that, and this is the part where we're figuring it out as an industry, and I'll say that collectively as an industry. The risks are real. That's the foot stomper there. There's no doubt that the risks are real. And is there a chance that you could expose competitive secrets or run afoul of regulations? Absolutely. And one example is, you know, supervisory information that comes from regulators is confidential, and it's confidential, and the dissemination of which is governed by the agency. So there's one regulation, and if you start sharing that information, you can be sanctioned. In fact, there's a couple of your listeners wanted to Google them. You can find some banks that ran afoul by sharing information that they shouldn't. So the risks are real, but you also hinted at the right solution at this point, and that is you have to have guardrails. You have to ring fence. You have to ring fence sensitive data. You have to use secure platforms and very clear about internally who gets the information and what gets fed into the model. So again, just kind of it doesn't even take a sophisticated like LLM developer to realize that the guardrails make sense. Just if there was a book on your shelf, you would have rules about who can read that book, who can check it out, what can it be used for, that type of thing. We need those simple kind of plain and simple solutions for our AI models too. So maybe if you were to put in a tagline, I would suggest that like innovation has to be paired with discipline, and that those go hand in glove. I personally think, two thoughts. One anecdotal. Again, I don't work at J.P. Morgan, but you read in the news about how they are so forward leaning in Gen AI. A big chunk of their bank is using it. They're obviously, if you know anything about their corporate structure, they're in everything. They're like, the mega bank of mega banks for good reasons. And yet they've quickly got to a point where they feel comfortable using AI for a lot of things, which would suggest that they've figured some things out. And I think that other banks could learn from the speed with which they adopted AI solutions for a lot of the things they did. And I also think that it's funny. I do think that even in the long run, this is just me personally thinking, I do think that some of the functions, the AI functions that are kind of cutting edge, will be intentionally degraded to mitigate some of those risks. So I think you can just kind of see that, whatever the latest tool that comes out and hits the market, banks are necessarily going to be about 2 or 3 steps behind that, just because their comfort level has to catch up.
Yeah, you know what? One thing I've wondered with that is, so all the cloud-based, the big models, the trillion plus
Yeah.
parameters and all that, but then there's the models like Llama,
Yeah.
and the ones that you can run on servers,
Yeah.
or even some of them small enough that you'd run on individual laptops or whatever. But I wonder, I don't know, in your crystal ball, to what you just mentioned, could you see banks saying, you know what, we don't want the capabilities of these large models that live in the cloud versus something that we could run. It's a fraction of the size. It's specially tuned. I don't know if it's like a Bloomberg GPT level thing. I mean, you're not going to tune from the ground up your own LLM, but I wonder if there's not some on-prem models that are running that maybe banks lean into a little more or
Oh yeah,
customize.
I think you nailed it. I think that's exactly what you're saying. I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but just kind of keeping my finger on the pulse, kind of industry wide. And oh, by the way, I will say that I very much I gravitate towards all the articles that you read about how other banks are doing things. And then of course, obviously banks talk in this conference and that conference, and that's what you're seeing. So you're seeing banks not necessarily create their own LLMs, but very much do scaled type solutions like that keep them off the large cloud infrastructure offerings, but doing them internally. And the nice thing about that is your data tends to be a little cleaner than it would, if you have a large model that has been trained on data that fills the spectrum, right? The nice thing about that is it's really, really robust model, but you also might be getting some data that's not necessarily pertinent to what you do as a bank, and that's kind of important to keep in mind. It feels like I sidestepped your. Did I?
No, you got it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah. And I just looking at time here. There's a couple more questions I wanted to ask, but I want to touch back before we wrap it up. I want to touch back on leadership because your start as an engineer and as an aviator, engineers and finance people are very similar. I think our nature is to be heads down and really focused on the hard skills and
Yep.
and just solving problems and being in spreadsheets. And I think for our listeners a lot, and maybe I'm projecting myself on on them too much, but there's so much more satisfaction and so much more comfort in just solving that problem, building the model and being down that level. It can be difficult to pull out of that and think about, I need to be a coach, a mentor, a leader, a decision maker, and also to develop my team and trust my team and all that. And I think I'd love to circle back and talk back about your Navy leadership role. And if there's something, since you've led sailors and finance teams, are there lessons that you carry over into the corporate life that I'm really looking for takeaways and something that could resonate with, if we have listeners out there who are aspiring to that first level of management, or maybe are new to the management role, or even more senior in their career, a way to think about leadership beyond just the hard tasks that we're doing.
Yeah, I love it. I'll kind of address that 2 ways. It took me a little while to get to this point, but there was clarity because being in the military, you're always reading, you're always having somebody say, "Here's a new leadership book. Here's a new book, how to manage this." And there was always a little bit of crossover for me that I never quite understood. And it was a little bit late in my journey that I realized that, and this is just a frame that I use management as tasking. And by that, and leadership is a psychological component that that's a little different. And by management, I mean, if you think about it, how do you manage yourself? You go, I'm going to manage my inbox. Well, I have a certain number of emails. I have a certain amount of time. I have a certain organizational thing that I do. So managing my inbox is tasking. I'm doing this. If you manage your own personal time, you're putting tasks to different windows of time in your day. If you have a team, you have a team of different skill sets and a certain job that needs to get done. You apply the skill sets and the person with those things. That's management to me. That's how I bucket that. And that's certainly satisfying, but that's one skill. But it's necessary and not sufficient to be a manager, but a leader. A leader is a different beast altogether. And to me, a leadership is fundamentally a practical application of psychology. And I'm not saying we're all psychologists, not even, what is it, Holiday Inn Express level psychologists, but just trying to put your mind around what makes people tick, why they're motivated, what is their why. Those are the type of questions that you need to understand. If a person is motivated by money, okay, then just understand that. No judgment, just understand that. Some people are motivated by just putting their head down and doing a good job regardless. Some people are motivated by stability. If you have a person who's motivated by stability, try to stretch them, but also understand that every time you try to stretch them out of their comfort zone, they may not do well, they may struggle. But that's psychological. That's less about tasking. So trying to step back and be that armchair psychologist that understands your team to help you motivate them to what they're doing. If I were to distill that down into two kind of lessons that come to mind that I try to keep front of mind is to try to build trust and try to have clarity. And clarity is people need to know what success looks like and why their role matters. This goes back to kind of the psychology, why you're doing what you're doing and when can we hang the banner. That's clarity. And then trust. Probably more so than in the outside world, the military is built on trust. You have to trust that the person who's working on your aircraft did a good job, that did they not cut corners. So there might be somebody that I barely even know in my squadron, but I've got to completely and implicitly trust them with my life. And you kind of do that with your air crew as well. If you have an air crew, you've got to trust that they're doing their job and they've got to trust you because the stakes are really high. I still think you can bring, even though that's kind of more front of mind in the military and in the Navy, I do think that trust carries over into the civilian world and finance as well.
Yeah, great answer and great takeaways from that. Well, as I'm looking at time here, we're coming in, we're looking at the arresting cables, our LSOs telling us what's going on. We're going to try to stick this landing here on time. I have two more questions I want to hit before we go though. And these are questions we ask everybody. I always love getting the responses to these. So the first is, what is something most people don't know about you? Something that they couldn't learn from your LinkedIn or online presence?
Oh, good question. Kind of a trivia fact about me. I would say, some people know, but most people don't know it. And that was, I had lived in 6 states before the age of 5. And this was not because my father was running from the law or anything like that. He was finishing up a military career and I just kept getting a better job and we kept moving because of it. So I had a bit of a peripatetic life in the first 5 or 6 years. And I don't know if it's actually slowed down, but that's kind of the fun fact about me.
Keeps it exciting. And when you move that often, that's one thing I miss about the military is you don't accumulate a lot of stuff because if you're moving it every 3 years, you're just like, leave it, go.
I should move more often.
Okay. All right. Last takeaway question here. What is your favorite Excel function and why?
I would have to say, I think it's index match. VLOOKUP is the classic. It's kind of the OG, if you will. But index match is a bit more flexible and a little bit more powerful. And I think anybody who's ever had to untangle kind of a messy spreadsheet knows that when you nail index match and it just works, there's this weird kind of satisfaction from knowing it worked and it spit out a result. So great question. The fact that I could answer that, I don't know what it says about me, but index match is my final answer.
Yeah. So I did 3 podcast recordings today, 3 for 3 on index match.
Really?
And on all of them,
Love it.
And on all of them, I volunteered I got my first CFO gig in 07.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit removed from being in the spreadsheets like I used to.
Yeah.
And I'm still a VLOOKUP guy. I understand. I'm just like, I don't know. I'm an old dog. I'm not going to learn new tricks.
Yeah.
Just give me my VLOOKUP and I'll be fine.
It's funny. I was, it's kind of the same thing with like a pivot table. I don't know if that's a function per se, but like the first time you crack the code on a pivot table, you think it's pure magic.
Yeah.
That's a little bit old school now, but yeah, I'm with you on the VLOOKUP. It's still tried and true.
Yeah. Well, Bobby, I've really enjoyed this. I loved you bringing your insights to our FP&A audience, and just thanks again for coming on the show.
Absolutely. It's great being here. Thanks for having me.